There are people who listen so well that others forget to listen back. People who sense the unspoken, who read pauses like sentences, who understand before they are asked to. They are often called kind, empathetic, mature, but beneath that quiet skill, something else can grow. Always understanding others can slowly erase the boundary where the self begins. It can turn empathy into obligation, patience into silence, and compassion into disappearance. Not because these people are weak, but because they are deeply perceptive in a world that rewards emotional availability more than emotional truth. This story is not about blaming empathy. It is about noticing what happens when understanding becomes a survival strategy rather than a choice. When being the one who gets it costs more than it gives. It usually begins without ceremony, no announcement, no decision. One day someone realizes that others talk to them differently, more carefully, more openly. They notice people pausing mid-sentence, as if trusting that whatever comes next will be received gently. They become the person others explain themselves to less because understanding is assumed. At first, it feels like closeness. Being the one who understands creates a quiet warmth. Conversations deepen faster, conflicts soften around them. People say things like, "You get me," or "I don't have to explain myself to you." Those words land softly, but they stay. They begin to define a role. Understanding becomes something expected, not offered. And slowly, without anyone asking, the self steps aside to make room for others. This role is rarely chosen consciously. It grows in small moments, listening a little longer, excusing behavior a little quicker, translating emotions others never learned to name. It forms when someone notices tension before it speaks, when they feel responsible for smoothing the emotional air in a room. They learn to anticipate reactions, to soften their tone before conflict arrives, to explain someone else's behavior before anyone criticizes it. Understanding becomes a reflex. There is a subtle pride in it at first, a sense of usefulness. Being emotionally fluent in a world that often struggles to communicate feels like a gift. Others lean on it, rely on it, and reliance can feel like connection, but something quietly shifts. The more they understand, the less they are asked how they feel, not because others are cruel, but because the role doesn't invite it. The understanding one seems complete, settled, whole. Their emotions become background noise, easily postponed. After all, they understand why now isn't the right time. They understand why someone else's pain is louder. They understand why waiting feels reasonable. Understanding starts to replace expression. In disagreements, they see every angle. In hurtful moments, they explain intentions instead of naming impact. In relationships, they become interpreters rather than participants. They learn to carry complexity alone. The world rewards this. Calmness is praised. Emotional maturity is admired. Being the bigger person becomes a compliment that never considers the cost. Each time they choose understanding over honesty, it is framed as strength, but strength, when unbalanced, becomes invisibility. There is a particular loneliness in being deeply seen for how well one sees others. People feel close to them, but not always with them. Over time, the role solidifies. They are the safe one, the stable one, the one who doesn't need much, and so, they ask for less, not because they have less, but because asking would disrupt the image. It would complicate the ease others feel around them. It would require explaining themselves, when they are used to being the one who understands without explanation. So they listen, they nod, they validate. Inside, something stays unsaid. The understanding one often senses this gap, but struggles to name it. It feels like standing slightly behind one's own life, like watching emotional exchanges happen through glass close. Visible, but just out of reach. They are present everywhere except where their own feelings are concerned. This is not selflessness in its pure form. It is adaptation. Understanding others becomes a way to maintain harmony, connection, safety, a way to belong without risking rejection. When others are comfortable, relationships feel stable. When relationships feel stable, there is less fear. And fear, even unspoken, shapes behavior. The quiet role is seductive because it promises peace. But peace achieved through self-erasure is fragile at this stage. Nothing feels broken. There is no crisis, no obvious pain. Just a subtle imbalance, a gentle leaning outward that never returns inward. And because understanding feels noble, the cost remains unnamed. Yet somewhere beneath the calm exterior, a question waits patiently. Not loudly, not urgently. Just quietly. Who is listening now? Long before understanding became a role, it was a response. Often it began in environments where emotions were unpredictable, where moods shifted without warning, where silence carried weight. and tone mattered more than words. In such spaces, attention became a form of safety. Reading the room wasn't sensitivity, it was survival. The child learned to notice small changes: a tightened jaw, a longer pause, a door closing louder than usual. These details were not meaningless. They were signals, early warnings, clues about what version of the world was about to appear. Understanding others became a way to stay one step ahead of discomfort. In families where feelings were not openly discussed, someone had to interpret them. In homes where conflict felt dangerous, someone learned how to soften it before it arrived. Sometimes, that someone was praised for being easy, mature, or wise beyond their years. Sometimes, they were simply left alone because they didn't cause trouble. Either way, the lesson was absorbed quietly. Peace is maintained by awareness. Love is preserved by accommodation. Belonging is earned by understanding. That understanding was not abstract. It was deeply embodied. The nervous system learned vigilance. The mind learned empathy not as connection but as prevention. To understand another's emotions was to anticipate outcomes, to reduce chaos, to keep relationships intact. And so, emotional attention turned outward. There was rarely space to ask what was wanted, needed, or felt. Those questions seemed indulgent in environments where others required management. Expressing personal emotions risked burdening someone already overwhelmed. Silence felt kinder. Adaptation felt necessary. Understanding became competence. Over time, this skill was reinforced. Teachers appreciated it. Friends relied on it. Adults trusted it. The understanding one became dependable, reasonable, and emotionally fluent. These qualities were rewarded, so they deepened. But what was learned early often remains unquestioned. Later, as life expanded beyond childhood, the pattern followed. In friendships, they became the listener. In relationships, the emotional translator. In conflict, the mediator who could articulate everyone's feelings except their own. Understanding others felt natural because it had always been necessary. What was less visible was what had been postponed. There was no space to develop an inner language for personal needs, no practice in emotional risk, no evidence that expressing confusion, anger, or sadness would be met with care rather than consequence. So, the self learned restraint. It learned that clarity was safer than vulnerability, that being perceptive earned acceptance, while being emotionally raw invited discomfort. It learned that relationships stayed smoother when one person absorbed complexity quietly. This is not a story of neglect alone. Sometimes, the environment was loving but emotionally limited. Sometimes, adults were present but overwhelmed. Sometimes, there was affection without a tunement. In all these cases, the result was similar. Understanding filled the gap. The child became emotionally older than their years, not because they wanted to be, but because someone had to hold the emotional map. And once learned, this role did not dissolve on its own. It matured by adulthood. Understanding others felt like personality rather than history. It was seen as kindness, emotional intelligence, depth. Rarely was it recognized as a learned pattern, rooted in adaptation. And patterns that once protected can later restrict. The understanding. One may not remember a moment when they chose this role. It feels like who they are. But beneath the calm exterior lies an origin shaped by necessity, not preference. A sensitivity sharpened too early, a responsibility accepted too quietly. This does not diminish the beauty of empathy. It simply contextualizes it. Understanding others was never weakness. It was intelligence responding to environment. But when that intelligence never turns inward, something remains unfinished. The origin story matters not to assign blame, but to restore choice. To recognize that what once kept connection intact may now be keeping the self distant, and distance, when prolonged, becomes unfamiliarity, not with others but with oneself. Empathy, at its core, is the ability to feel with another person, to sense emotion beyond words, to recognize inner states that are not explicitly expressed. It is often described as a bridge, something that brings people closer together. But psychology reveals that empathy is not a single experience. It exists on a spectrum, shaped by temperament, environment, and learning. For some, empathy develops as a shared exchange. For others, it becomes a constant orientation outward. The difference is subtle, but significant. There is cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what someone else is feeling, and there is emotional empathy, the ability to feel it internally. When both operate intensely, the nervous system remains in near constant attunement to others. For the understanding one, this attunement rarely switches off. Research in psychology describes a phenomenon often referred to as emotional hypervigilance. The mind continuously scans social environments for emotional cues, facial expressions, tone shifts, pauses, body language all are processed rapidly, often unconsciously. This does not feel like effort. It feels like awareness that the brain's mirror neuron system plays a role here. These neural circuits activate when observing another person's emotional state, creating an internal simulation of that experience. In balanced empathy, this simulation informs connection. In unbalanced empathy, it overwhelms boundaries. When someone has learned early that emotional awareness equals safety, the brain reinforces this pattern. Dopamine rewards accuracy. Cortisol rises when signals are missed. The body learns that understanding others is not optional, it is protective. Over time, empathy becomes fused with identity. Another psychological layer emerges: emotional labor. This term describes the often invisible work of managing feelings one's own and others to maintain social harmony. While commonly discussed in professional contexts, emotional labor frequently exists in personal relationships as well. The understanding one carries this labor quietly. They regulate the emotional temperature of conversations. They phrase truths gently to avoid discomfort. They absorb tension so others don't have to. This constant modulation requires cognitive and emotional resources, even when it feels natural. And yet, there is rarely reciprocity. Psychology also recognizes people-pleasing tendencies as a survival adaptation rather than a personality flaw. When approval or safety was once contingent on emotional accommodation, the brain learned association. Understanding equals acceptance. So resistance feels risky. Saying I don't understand feels unsafe. Saying I'm hurt feels disruptive. Saying this matters to me feels like asking for too much. The nervous system associates expression with consequence. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to notice is its social reward. Empathy is praised. Emotional intelligence is admired. Being calm under pressure is respected. The understanding one is rarely confronted because confrontation would require others to look inward. Instead, the burden remains internal. Psychologically, this creates a split. One part of the self remains highly developed: social awareness, emotional interpretation, relational sensitivity. Another part remains underdeveloped: self-recognition, emotional assertion, internal permission. The result is an individual who understands others deeply but struggles to feel understood themselves. This is not a failure of empathy. It is empathy without containment. Without boundaries, empathy stops being connective and becomes consumptive. The emotional system absorbs more than it releases. Over time, this imbalance can lead to exhaustion, resentment, or emotional numbness, not because empathy is harmful, but because it is unregulated. The mind begins to confuse responsibility with awareness. Just because something is understood does not mean it must be carried, but this distinction is learned slowly. Psychology does not frame this as pathology. It is adaptation responding to context. A highly sensitive system learning to navigate complexity early. The problem arises only when the pattern remains unquestioned, when empathy is never paired with self-presence, when understanding replaces participation. The science clarifies one quiet truth: empathy is not meant to flow in only one direction. Without return, even the most compassionate system begins to shut down. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, silently. Knowing what others feel does not make it easier to know what to do with oneself. This is where the conflict lives. The understanding one senses tension before it speaks, but hesitates to address it. Not because the truth is unclear, but because the consequences are too visible. Every possible reaction is already imagined. Every emotional ripple already calculated. Speaking up feels heavy with responsibility. They understand how words might land. They understand how timing could hurt. They understand how honesty could shift the balance of a relationship. And so, silence feels considerate. Inside, however, something resists. A quiet discomfort, a feeling of being slightly misaligned with one's own life. Not wrong, just incomplete. This conflict is not loud. It rarely erupts into anger. It hums beneath the surface as tension without language. There is guilt for wanting space when others need closeness. Guilt for feeling unseen when others feel understood. Guilt for craving reciprocity while believing one should be self-sufficient. Understanding others creates moral pressure. If their pain is understandable, then protest feels unjustified. If their behavior has context, then boundaries feel selfish. If intentions are good, then impact feels negotiable, then understanding one begins to argue against their own emotions. They minimize hurt by explaining it away. They postpone needs by empathizing with timing. They rationalize absence by acknowledging limitations. Every internal reaction is met with analysis rather than permission. This is not emotional intelligence, it is emotional restraint. Over time, the inner world becomes crowded, feelings stack without resolution, each one acknowledged intellectually, but rarely felt fully. There is awareness without release, and awareness alone does not heal. The fear beneath this conflict is rarely acknowledged. The fear of being misunderstood, of finally speaking, only to be met with defensiveness, confusion, or withdrawal. When someone has spent their life understanding others, the idea of not being understood feels destabilizing. Misunderstanding feels like rupture, so the self adapts again. It softens language, delays truth, chooses neutrality over clarity. It becomes easier to carry discomfort than to risk disconnection. But this creates another fracture. The understanding one begins to feel emotionally alone, not because others are absent, but because presence is filtered. Only the parts that feel acceptable are shared. The rest remain internalized, translated into patience rather than expression. There is a specific grief in this experience, not the grief of loss but of absence. The absence of being met without explanation, the absence of someone staying with discomfort instead of needing it. Softened, they give what they secretly long for, and longing, when unspoken, becomes heavines. The inner conflict sharpens during moments of exhaustion, when empathy feels less generous and more obligatory, when understanding no longer brings closeness, but distance. When compassion begins to feel like a one-way movement, yet even then, resistance feels dangerous. Because who are they without this role? Understanding has become identity. Removing it feels like erasing value. If they stop accommodating, will they still be wanted? If they stop interpreting, will they still belong? These questions rarely surface consciously. They live in hesitation, in the delayed message, in the softened response, in the swallowed truth. The understanding one often tells themselves that this is maturity, that wanting less is growth, that being unaffected is strength. But emotional absence is not peace. The body keeps score, tension appears in subtle ways, fatigue lingers, irritation leaks out unexpectedly. There may be moments of numbness where feeling anything feels distant. This is not burnout in the dramatic sense. It is quiet depletion. The conflict deepens. Continue understanding others at the cost of the self, or risk disruption by becoming visible. Neither option feels safe, so the self waits. And in that waiting, something slowly asks to be acknowledged. Not loudly, not urgently, just truthfully. There is no single moment when it becomes too much, no dramatic collapse, no clear ending. The breaking point arrives quietly, disguised as tiredness, as a sense of emotional heaviness that does not lift with rest, as a growing distance between what is felt and what is shown. The understanding one may still listen, still respond thoughtfully, still hold space, but something has changed beneath the surface. The ease is gone, the generosity feels thinner, empathy no longer flows, it is measured. This is not bitterness, it is fatigue. They begin to notice a subtle resentment, not toward others, but toward the role itself. The role that requires endless consideration, the role that rarely receives the same depth in return, the role that has blurred the line between kindness and self-neglect. Understanding starts to feel compulsory. Moments that once felt connecting now feel draining. Conversations repeat familiar patterns. Others share freely, assuming emotional availability. The understanding one nods, but inside, there is an ache for reciprocity that remains unspoken. This is often when numbness appears. Not total numbness, just selective quiet. Emotions flatten, joy feels distant, sadness feels muted. The inner world becomes less vivid, as if dimmed to conserve energy. Feeling fully would require resources that are already depleted. Psychologically, this is a protective response. When emotional systems are overloaded without release, the mind reduces intensity. It is not failure, it is containment. But containment without expression leads to disconnection. At this stage, the understanding one may question themselves. Why does empathy feel heavy now? Why does patience feel forced? Why does caring feel like work? They may wonder if they have changed, if something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. This is the nervous system signaling imbalance. There is also a subtle grief that surfaces here, the grief of realizing how often one's own emotions have been postponed, how many moments of discomfort were smoothed instead of spoken, how many needs were acknowledged internally but never voiced. This realization is unsettling because it challenges a long-held the image of being fine, of being stable, of being the one who does not need much. Needing more feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity creates hesitation. The breaking point is not a rejection of empathy, it is a reckoning with its cost, a recognition that understanding without boundaries is unsustainable. This awareness does not immediately change behavior. Patterns rarely dissolve on contact. Instead, it creates internal friction, a growing sense that something must shift even if the shape of that shift is unclear. The understanding one may begin to withdraw slightly, less available, more quiet, not as punishment, but as instinct. The system searches for rest. Others may notice the change. They may feel distance without understanding why. They may sense something is different, but not know how to respond. After all, they are accustomed to being understood, not to understanding in return. This is a tender moment, because here, the understanding one stands at the edge of recognition. The realization that empathy alone cannot carry a life. That emotional presence must include the self, not just others. The breaking point is not an end. It is a pause, a space where the old role no longer fits, but the new one has not yet formed. And in that space, a quiet truth becomes harder to ignore. Understanding others should not require disappearing. The shift does not begin with confrontation. It begins with awareness, not the awareness that analyzes others, but the awareness that turns inward without judgment. The noticing of emotional responses as they arise. The recognition of tension, fatigue, desire, discomfort, not to fix them, not to explain them away, simply to allow them to exist. For the understanding one, this is unfamiliar territory. Presence has long meant attunement to others. Now it asks for something quieter, a willingness to stay with one's own emotional experience without immediately translating it into empathy. This does not feel dramatic. It feels subtle, almost uncomfortable. There may be moments of hesitation, where the impulse to explain someone else's behavior is interrupted by a pause. A moment where the familiar reflex of accommodation softens, just enough to let a personal feeling surface. That feeling is not always clear. Sometimes it appears as irritation without cause, sadness without story, a heaviness that resists naming. These emotions were always there, they were simply unattended. Learning to stay present means allowing these states to be felt without apology. This is not the abandonment of empathy, it is its expansion. Empathy that includes the self does not diminish compassion for others. It contextualizes it, it restores proportion, it allows understanding to be shared rather than absorbed. Psychologically, this shift involves nervous system regulation. When attention is no longer exclusively external, the system begins to settle. Emotional responses move through instead of stagnating. Boundaries begin to form naturally, not as defenses, but as clarity. There is often fear here. Fear of becoming selfish, fear of losing connection, fear of being less kind. But presence reveals something important. Honesty does not erase empathy, it refines it. The understanding one begins to notice that not every feeling requires explanation. Not every discomfort requires resolution. Some emotions simply ask to be acknowledged. This internal acknowledgement is foundational. It creates a sense of being accompanied from within, a feeling of self-trust that does not depend on external validation. Gradually, something shifts in relationships. When the understanding one remains present with themselves, responses become more grounded, less performative, more truthful. There is less urgency to soothe, to fix, to interpret. Space opens for mutual engagement rather than emotional management. This can feel disorienting to both sides. Others may encounter unfamiliar boundaries, pauses where there was once immediate understanding, questions where there was once quiet acceptance. This is not rejection, it is differentiation. The understanding one is still empathetic but no longer invisible. Presence allows empathy to become a choice again, not a reflex, not an obligation. A conscious offering. And choice changes the emotional landscape. When empathy is chosen, it replenishes rather than drains. When understanding is mutual, it deepens connection rather than dissolving the self. This stage is not about perfection. There will still be moments of Old patterns do not vanish easily, but they soften, they loosen their grip. What emerges is not a new identity but a fuller one, a self that understands others and remains connected inward, a compassion that flows both ways, a calm that is no longer maintained by silence. Learning to stay present is not an ending, it is a return. To sensation, to emotion, to self. And from that place, understanding becomes something shared rather than something carried alone. There is a quieter kind of wisdom that emerges when empathy no longer requires sacrifice. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It feels like steadiness. Understanding others, when balanced, becomes a shared space rather than a burden. A meeting point where awareness flows in both directions. No one disappears. No one performs. There is room for complexity without collapse. The understanding one no longer feels responsible for carrying every emotional weight. They recognize the difference between noticing and absorbing, between compassion and this distinction is gentle but transformative. Balance does not mean becoming less empathetic. It means allowing empathy to have edges, limits that protect presence rather than restrict care. When empathy has boundaries, it gains sustainability. There is a new kind of listening here, one that does not rush to translate or soothe, one that allows discomfort to exist without immediately resolving it. This kind of listening honors both people in the exchange. The understanding one may still sense unspoken emotions, still recognize nuance, still hold depth. But now, these abilities coexist with self-awareness. Silence is no longer default. Patience is no longer automatic. Understanding is no longer unconditional. And yet, it remains sincere. There is also grief in this realization. A soft mourning for the self that learned too early to prioritize harmony over expression. For the years spent being emotionally fluent but internally distant. This grief is not heavy, it is clarifying. It allows compassion to move backward in time, to the younger self who learned that understanding kept things stable, to the version of the self that equated being needed with being valued. This compassion is not indulgent, it is restorative. Balance teaches that being understood is not a luxury, it is a need, and needs do not diminish worth. In this final space, empathy becomes reciprocal not because others change, but because the self no longer disappears. The understanding one remains open, but not empty, present, but not consumed. There is freedom in this. Freedom to listen without losing oneself. Freedom to care without carrying everything. Freedom to be complex without apology. The dark side of always understanding others was never empathy itself. It was the quiet assumption that understanding must come at the cost of self-presence. When that assumption dissolves, empathy returns to its original purpose, not as a shield, not as a role, but as a bridge. A bridge that connects without erasing what it touches. And in that balance, there is something deeply human. Not perfection, not resolution, just a calm, honest presence, one that understands and is understood.